I want to thank this panel for joining us to discuss balancing open data and privacy in research. We've had a couple questions already get to kick off about that topic at the end of the last panel, and it's an ongoing issue for many of us who work with all different types and sensitivities of data. So I'd like to thank Malar Veerapan from the World Bank for moderating this panel. Malar is a senior data scientist and data management team lead here at the World Bank, and she leads the team that manages the statistical data and dissemination functions and supports key data indicators such as the World Development Indicators, the World Bank's APIs on the catalog. She oversees data management and technology for the institution's open data strategy, and she's part of the task team that launched the World Bank's Open Data Initiative in 2010. She's now supporting the Secretariat for the Data Council, a bank body that works on framing the institutional data priorities and therefore working on emerging big data and geospatial data programs. Joining her are Simpson Garfinkel from the U.S. Census Bureau, who's a computer scientist at the National Institute of Standards and Technology's Information Technology Laboratory. His research interests include big data, privacy, usability, social justice, and data fusion. He holds 7 U.S. patents and has published dozens of research articles on computer security and digital forensics. Merce Croesus is joining us from Harvard University's Institute for Quantitative Social Science, where she is the research data officer and the chief data scientist and technology officer. In her role as the university's research data officer, she provides leadership to mature Harvard's data management and governance practices. She coordinates support for the research data life cycle and guides university processes and procedures for handling research data. She's also the co-PI of the Sloan-funded OpenDP project to build an open source platform for differential privacy tools, and the PI of the Open Source Software Health Index project. She's a co-author of the Fair Data Principles and the Data Citation Principles. Finally, we have Anya Sautman joining us from MIT JPAL. She joined JPAL in July 2017 as Director of Research, Education, and Training. She's guiding JPAL's efforts in providing research support to regional offices and fostering research transparency. She also oversees JPAL's training and education initiatives. She has ongoing projects in healthcare and malaria prescription practices in Mali and electricity pricing in South Africa. Previously, she was an assistant professor at Brown University, where she taught graduate and undergraduate classes in development, econ, and applied research methods. So thank you all for joining us today.
And just quickly, there was a phone that was found that was lost.
And with that, I'll give the floor to Malar to give us an introduction and lead the panel.
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me. I think this is such a fascinating event that DIME team has pulled together, and also a big welcome to our expert panelists. It's awesome that you could join us today this afternoon. And I think the topic of open data and privacy is just so important at the juncture we are. I'd like to start off with a little bit of background to open data. I think most people are familiar probably here with the Open Data Initiative. The World Bank has been a leader in the open data movement since 2010. And I think the movement has really unlocked a lot of the data sets that has been behind subscription walls or otherwise, locked up in people's hard drive. And while the challenges of opening up, for instance, let's say macro level country data has not been that it's not been that difficult. We did lose a lot of income for sure, but we gained a whole bunch of audience and a good reputation because of opening up the data. But the challenges were very different when it came to other types of data. For instance, microdata. The bank has been working on a microdata library for many years. So when the Open Data Initiative happened, there was an expectation that all microdata is to be opened. And many of this data that we have are not owned by the bank. It comes from countries. We needed to think of the legal, ethical considerations when it comes to data sharing. We started looking at the terms of use that we needed to sort of construct for that. We started looking at what other agencies are doing, and we adopted whatever was a standard at that point in time. But I don't think we've solved the problem with just having that. And it's this sort of, if you look at what are existing standards today, when you start looking at some of the more personal information that we're collecting nowadays, I don't think an industry standard exists. So there are multiple opinions, sort of multiple debates. So it's kind of hard to for us to kind of figure out which ones do you pick and which way do you go. But nevertheless, I think privacy is a topic that the bank as an institution has started taking very seriously. Just last year, the bank has set up a data privacy office that exclusively thinks about private data, personal information, more specifically. We also have a chief data officer. We've also instituted new programs such as the Development Data Hub, which looks at how do you look at the data flow within the organization, how do you share information within the organization and also outside with external parties. What are some of the disclosure risks? How do we measure that? So we have instituted certain procedures and protocols within the institution. We've also developed some open source programs called SDC Micro for measuring statistical disclosure risks, and we've been sort of also training countries on those, but we do have a long way to go. Since we are kind of at the forefront of this open data, people sometimes get scared when we are talking about data sharing, and we kind of tell them we don't do open data at no cost. I think we take privacy very seriously, and we want to strike a good balance between privacy and openness. We can use the data sets that we have, we can put them to great use, and also in a way that we are very transparent about it. But what that means and what the landscape is I think is a discussion today. And I would like to start off with Simpson, to sort of kickstart this discussion, and then we will follow with the other panelists.
Thanks. And I was told to talk for about 7.5 minutes. So I was originally going to talk about why the Census Bureau is moving to differential privacy and why adding noise to data actually increases transparency. And I'll try to get there, but based on the previous discussions, I think I'm the one who asked the question about these tools that look for personally identifiable information in a data set and tell you that there are no names and SSNs in it, so it must be safe to release. And we now have many cases of academic and commercial organizations that have released data sets that they thought that were collected under a promise of confidentiality. And in the released data set, the organization thought that individual information couldn't be identified, but it was identified. And in most cases, it wasn't identified for commercial gain, and it wasn't identified for a national security reason, but it was identified to embarrass the researchers who released the data set. It was identified to discredit the organization that collected and released the data. And it was identified to make the academic career of the professor or graduate student who did the re-identification. So you need to understand that there is an active adversary out there, and the adversary is really smart people, and they have more time than you do, and they have more computer power than you do, and they have access to every data set in the universe that they have access to. They have access to data sets that don't exist when you make your data publication. So you might release a data set that has somebody's precise height in it, and then a year later another data set is released that has a precise height linked to a name. And so all of a sudden your data set that had that precise height and had like their religious beliefs and had like their sexual history is identifiable because of this data set that didn't exist when you made your release. Now, that is why it is essential that every data release, whether it's microdata or aggregated data, have noise added. Because if you add noise, then nobody who gets that future data release can do a link and say this is a good link because we have an exact match. Because even if there is an exact match, you can say, well, it's deniable. Maybe there's an exact match because noise was added. And that's the core idea of differential privacy, to create this ability to break the link between a data release and abstract ground truth reality that exists. That's why the Census Bureau is moving to differential privacy for all of our data releases, because it's the only way to assure the confidentiality of the data that we collect. You have to add noise. And what differential privacy gives us is a mathematical framework for making the trade-off between how much noise we add and the accuracy of the data that we publish. So we talk about this curve, this trade-off between accuracy and privacy loss associated with a data release. And there's an organized group of demographers and social scientists that are opposed to the use of differential privacy by the Census Bureau. And they're opposed to it on, I'll say, religious grounds. And the religion they have is this belief that they have a right to the real data, or that they don't want us adding this uncertainty in the data that's published, as if the data that we previously published had no uncertainty in it, right? Like, as if there really was a ground truth that we were publishing. So there's always uncertainty. What differential privacy allows us to do is to control the added uncertainty traded off with the privacy loss resulting from that data publication. And we would like to engage our critics in a very rational discussion of how accurate do the data need to be to serve your goals versus what is the impact on the people of the United States for releasing these data. And clearly for some data there's a high impact, and for some data there's a low impact. And so fundamentally this is an economic trade-off, balancing two public goods: the public good of protecting people's confidentiality and the public good of enabling science to be done with the data that we release. So that's the key idea. And in terms of transparency, the other big advantage of differential privacy is it allows the public and it allows scientists to look inside the black box that did the privacy protection mechanism. So previously, all the privacy protection mechanisms depended in part on secrecy to achieve their privacy protection goals. With differential privacy, the only secrets is the actual amount of noise that was added to each measurement that is published. Now, you can apply differential privacy to the microdata, or you can apply it to the published results. You get much better accuracy for a given privacy loss if you apply it to the published results than to the microdata. And we're doing a lot of research on how to improve that. But nothing else needs to be kept confidential. You can show people the code that you use. You can't show people the confidential data, but you can show people all the results. And that's another major reason for the move, because of the increased transparency. So I'll save my last minute.
Hi, I'm Mercè Crosses. I would like to start with a little bit of background of what we've been doing at the Institute for Quantitative Social Science for the last almost 15 years, and more broadly with the Harvard Dataverse and the Dataverse project. I was fortunate to just already been, the project has been introduced this morning, so I saw some of the groups that presented are using Dataverse. So you already have some understanding of what it is, a platform or repository for sharing research data. Just to give you a few metrics, though, a few numbers of where we've grown since 2006 when we started the project. There are now at Harvard Dataverse 90,000 data sets that are hosted there. About 35,000 of those have been deposited directly to the Harvard repository. There are 45 other Dataverse sites around the world in 6 continents that host other Dataverse repositories, and those repositories can harvest the metadata so they can federate among each other. And we've grown an open source community. The project is open source, but the community has contributed to the code. There are about 100 programmers contributing to the code now, besides the team at Harvard, the small team that I lead there. So it is really a community effort now, and we're very proud of that part. And we're trying to understand how to, as part of the sustainability and part of transparency, how we grow that community, how we bring more people to be part of the project. So that's one aspect of the Dataverse. What we've been doing, though, is in collaboration with other groups, is more recently has been to see what we can do to improve the quality of the data sets we have there and the reproducibility of the replication packages that the researchers, the authors deposit to Dataverse. So to do that, first we looked at of all these 90,000 data sets, about 8,000, 9,000 of them are replication data sets. And I know we've been using the term replication reproducibility, but we started that long ago. We called it replication. Now probably would be called computational reproducible data sets. But that means that these 90,000 of them have the data and the code that supposedly should reproduce, or at least should have all the files to be able to reproduce the results. We looked, for example, of those, there were about almost 3,000 of them that had R code, and we looked how easy it would be just to take all that R code, of these 3,000 replication data sets, run it, execute it, and see whether they ran. Not even if they reproduced, whether they ran. We find that 85% of them didn't execute, and most of the problems were very simple. So it's not that the science was necessarily wrong or that the research study was wrong, but they were missing. Well, the file directory, the path to the directory was not specified well, or that there were some missing files or libraries and so. But altogether, it gave an indication of what problems that we've heard in the previous panel of the difficulty, right, of reproducing, just even when you have a repository, the transparency with the data and the code. So we're doing several things to improve that, or help improve that. That is, one is that building a tool that see how we can automate the cleaning up of the code that gets deposited at the time of deposit. And maybe cannot fix every problem, but we identify the problems to be, as I said, relatively simple ones. So some might be able to fix on the fly, but some of them might be able to create at least a report to the data depositor to say, here are the things that failed, and you might want to improve it before you release your replication data set. So that's one. I just started, a postdoc just started in my group to work on that just this last week, actually. So another project is integration with replication tools or replication platforms like CodeOcean, for example, that you could take the data and the code, upload it in a container-like environment where it has already R, Python, and many versions of it. It simplifies the process of having to set up the environment that is needed to run the code. And then there is a verification process that happens. Sometimes is would be with the ODAM group, as we heard, right, from the ODAM Institute, or within CodeOcean. And then at the end of the process, there is a capsule that we also heard before, that it's basically a container, like a Docker container, right, that will get deposited to Dataverse as the replication capsule. This is a project that is funded by Sloan, and we're working on it still, but that's one of the projects. And then the other thing is that also in a way of providing incentive for creating these replication packages, we also looking into using the badges. That might be some of extending the badges from Center for Open Science, or some other type of progress bar certification that tells you how transparent, how complete this data set is, Does it have the data code? Was it reproduced by somebody else? What else does it need? And so we're trying to identify what would be the best way to indicate that in a data set. And then if I still have some minutes about sensitive data, what we're doing for supporting sensitive data. So we have two projects that complement each other. One is the data tax project, which is a set of policies, like a standardized way of creating data policies by defining 6 levels that goes from blue, green, yellow, orange, red, and crimson as the you can never, it's the Harvard color, so it's always a joke that you can never release that data behind neighbors and so. But it's the most restricted. But basically, what it helps is to have a same language, to be able to communicate from system to system, to be able to understand the sensitivity of the data set and have a set of rules for access and security that apply to every level. So, for example, blue would be completely open. You can release it without even having to require to register to a repository. And so green, you would require to register, but it still doesn't require any security. Has a security requirements for encryption or so, then every level becomes more restricted and with that stronger requirements for security and for access. And when you have sensitive data, you need to release it with a data use agreement, and only those that can be approved to access the data. They could access it into a data enclave or so. So we're working on that, but at the same time, we're working with the OpenDP project. We just started now, also funded by Sloan, and we're in fact hiring now for the project. So it's a very beginning. But the OpenDP is Open Differential Privacy, stands for the Open Differential Privacy. And the idea is to integrate it also with Dataverse, but with other repositories or with other data systems. And well, for one thing, it's an open source community to build a set of tools for differential privacy, libraries for using in differential privacy, and a platform to be able to develop that, to implement the differential privacy for your data center or data set. And just to put it in how it connects with Dataverse and with data tags, you could imagine having a data set that might be red in the sense of has sensitive data. You would only be able to access it if you would go through a whole set of approvals, and you might not have access to the entire data set, but you might be able to release a differential private data set of this one, or differential private statistics, or have using the curator model of differential privacy, a way to do some queries to the data with a budget, with a privacy budget associated with it, but in a way that you can still access the data. It becomes in that way, for example, a green data set. Right now, you don't have to go through the data use agreements and through all these approvals. You can access that differential private version. That allows you, in some cases, would allow you to reproduce the results when possible. So this is putting everything together. Thank you.
All right. Well, as you might have noticed in the description of what people do, so I feel I'm by far the least technical in this panel, the least sort of expert actually on privacy. But I do think I bring some perspective to this that comes more from sort of from my background and from what JPAL is doing. So as you know, JPAL is an affiliate network. So Gisela talked a lot actually about where our data comes from, where our data publication comes from. So it's a network of affiliated faculty who conduct RCTs. I'm myself a researcher as well, and JPAL is partly involved in collecting data because our regional offices employ research staff who support projects. But then on the institutional side, we provide data publication support. We have a Dataverse where we publish this data, or we support affiliates in publishing their data. And of course, as a researcher myself, I'm also a user of published data in secondary research. So I think there is something special about the data we have, and that is very different from the census data, for example. And that is that it's primary data collection done by social scientists individually who are basically, well, on their own in some ways, on the ground. They are working with often very junior research staff, and they're collecting their own data, sometimes completely new measures from populations that aren't surveyed very often in development contexts and contexts where the privacy legal environment is not very strong. At the same time, so as you know, JPAL has been at the forefront of pushing research transparency and especially data publication. Some of our researchers, both in JPAL official functions on the board and on the executive committee as co-chairs of initiatives, have been themselves really early in terms of, for instance, writing pre-analysis plans, also publishing their own data before many other people have done that and before a lot was known about these things. But also as an institution, we have data publication requirements in all our funding. We are hosting this Dataverse. We're providing data publication support and so on. So we really try to get data out there, partly for replication purposes, but also for reuse in secondary research. We believe that this data is very useful and important about populations that are under-surveyed in some sense, and the data should be out there to be used. Now, the other fundamental principle that JPAL is following is we really care about ethics and the welfare of the human subjects we are surveying. We have a lot of standards. Almost all our research protocols relate to IRB protocols, sticking to informed consent procedures, protecting identified data in the field, and so on. Now, how does this all fit together? Well, I think from my perspective, both as a researcher and overseeing JPAL's data publication activities, I feel there is both, to some degree, missing tools for individual researchers and also missing guidelines. So I'm now learning, and this is amazing, that there will be maybe sometime in the near future more tools for applying some of these really complex techniques and sort of differential privacy or some protection for data, some access mechanisms that are more restricted, that are also accessible for individual researchers without a massive infrastructure and a lot of funding. But at the moment, that's not the case. If you want to publish your data, you typically, well, in the past, people have just put them on their own website, or they have put them on the, well, you know, if they are lucky, on the AAA website, and if they are less lucky, maybe on the Dataverse or on some other journal's website. But generally, there wasn't a lot of space available where you can publish your data with restricting access and controlling this access in some way. And then when you look at some of these privacy frameworks, and I should say I'm looking at them from a pretty lay perspective, but when I look at them, the ones that are published or what you've just discussed, you know, in terms of what the legal framework is, levels of sensitivity of the data. So typically what they do is they look at differential degrees of sensitivity from negligible risk to very high risk, including maybe risk of death, you know, if you have gang violence data or something like that. And then on the other axis is how de-identified or how anonymized is this data. And we all know here that anonymized isn't even a term anymore to be used in the context of big data and potentially future identifiability if other data becomes available. So now, when I look at these frameworks, they are saying, for example, in the sensitivity category, risk of divorce, life-altering event. What's typically assumed in these is that there is some illicit user of the data out there, and this person is going into the data, re-identifying it, disclosing the information to a malicious party, say a scorned partner or a spouse, and then this is the potentially life-altering event that could result. Now think of all the data that we collect, from fertility data to wealth data to even choices in experiments. Almost all of these could be, for some people, involving the risk of divorce. Think also about so for my own research, I've done a lot of research on sex selection in India using DHS data. So the NFHS of India from 2005, I think, is the one that I looked at. I actually just looked at the data again. Has very few women in it that have more than 12 children. There is, in fact, 6 who have 13 children, 2 who have 14 children, and 1 each who have 15 and 16 children. Now, these are identifiable data points, right? If I know a woman in India with 16 kids, there's something I can look up about her in the NFHS. But now you see a little bit where I'm coming from when I talk about, so this is the sensitivity conditional on someone doing this procedure, looking this person up, knowing her in person. But the risk never in these frameworks doesn't often discuss what the risk is of someone actually conducting this type of activity, trying to re-identify the data. So that's the first thing that I struggle with when we publish data. And then the other thing that I struggle with is that a lot of these frameworks are designed for, and the legal frameworks are designed for data that has been collected under mandatory schemes, like censuses in many countries are mandatory for citizens, but also are maybe collected by entities who don't ask permission at all and don't ask any questions, but rather use administrative data. Our data is primary data, and it's collected with IRB approval and under informed consent procedures. This came up before in someone's talk already in the lightning talks, but I think this is a really important distinction because we give people the chance to opt out of the survey entirely, and at least at JPAL, we train all our surveys very carefully to accept refusals in the data collection and to not collect data if the person says, sorry, I'm uncomfortable sharing this information. We also have some standardized language, for example, for allowing publication later, and we try to do this in accessible ways. So, for example, using 8th grade language, for example, simple language to explain what data publication might mean. And so, putting all of these things together, I feel that the practice and the decision-making and how we classify risk of the data is pretty difficult to do based on these standard schemas. And I also would not know exactly how to classify a lot of data into sort of low risk versus high risk, given all of these things that people have given informed consent, that in principle many things involve divorce risk depending on what kind of person you're looking at and what kind of partners. And so now going back to our own data practices, we have worried a lot about privacy violations. And so what we did actually, and this is much simpler and much more basic, we have conducted a data audit at some point. We wanted to know how often actually in publicly available data published by individual researchers, such as JPAL's affiliated researchers would be. We wanted to ask how often privacy is actually violated. And we didn't go for any of these risks for re-identification risk. We just looked for PII in the actual data. And what we found, so I don't want to go into the details of what we did, but essentially it was data sets. This was purely internal. We didn't publish this. We don't think this should be published because there was no sampling or anything like that. We just looked kind of at some data sets. But what we found is that 14% of the data had PII. We usually contacted the researchers immediately, and they immediately rectified the problem, took the data down, removed the PII. So in other words, this was human error. This was in no way intentional. But this data might still be sitting on some people's computers who downloaded it and never replaced it with the new version that was published. It should also be said that in many, many cases, this was benign. So the PII was linked maybe to a kid's grade in math in the 3rd grade, right? It's not actually obvious that this is very harmful data in many cases. But it opens you up to all sorts of questions. You were talking about the risk to researchers of being exposed or in some way shamed or embarrassed for publishing the data. We want people to publish data, but we are also exposing them to these risks, and we have little guidelines to give in terms of assessing the risk, both of what happens if the data is disclosed and what's the risk that someone will try to re-identify your data. So what we do at JPAL currently, and this is really showing you the extent to how much of this is kind of playing it by ear, our RAs all have IRB training, and they usually get put on the IRB of any researchers they support in publishing. Then we conduct the PII scan that we introduced after this data audit. We use some masking techniques like blurring some of the GPS data or anything like that, or removing GPS data usually entirely. And then for indirect identifiers such as fertility, birth order of kids or something like that, we basically discuss it with the researchers and ask them how they feel about this. What does your IRB say? what do you think we should be doing? How much of this information should we remove? And we rely very much on informed consent and the right of the participants to refuse. And we have to in some ways, because otherwise we would not be able to publish a lot of data. So I guess the short of what I'm saying is that I think there's kind of a missing framework for this type of situation. And I'm really just throwing this out for discussion. I'd be really interested on how people feel and think about this. And also if there's any more, how other people are doing this.
I'd like to talk briefly to the risk assessment issue that you just raised. Risk assessment's really hard. And we know from good work in privacy that research subjects are poor in their ability to articulate all risks. And that's not just true of research subjects. Most people are poor at being able to articulate privacy risks from actions that they take today. And so if researchers are not good at assessing risk, and if the research subjects are not good at assessing risk, and if IRBs are poor at assessing risk, because we all have worked with IRBs, how do we do it?
I think she was asking you, and you were asking.
Maybe.
You want to answer? I was going to add something, but you want to answer.
I think you should answer this.
Probably we don't have a complete answer, but that's partially that's what that data tax framework is trying to resolve, and it doesn't resolve it completely, but at least it says if there is some risk, if the data has been de-identified and there is some risk of re-identification, you don't make it completely open, but you make it green, and that means that the person who downloads the data needs to register, and you have an audit, a way to audit who has downloaded the data. If you identify later on that there is the risk becomes higher, identify that it might be a way to re-identify it, you can track who has used the data and connect the people. It's not a foolproof solution, but it's better than at least it adds some policy around.
So we could start by not allowing people to download data ever.
No, but I'm not saying that, right?
But I'm saying we could not allow people to download data. We could require instead that they upload their analysis programs. And even without differential privacy, even knowing that an analysis program can still enable browsing, simply not having many, many copies of potentially sensitive data sets littering the cyberspace might be a way of improving privacy, and would also help us move to a better environment where we're doing secure computing in enclaves and being able to very precisely control the kinds of analyses. And so what I'd like to see is these data archiving facilities and these dataverses have a computational aspect. Mm-hmm. So many of these are hosted in Amazon, and you could allow people to spin up virtual machines and do analysis in your environment and not let people download the data.
Yeah. We're just putting a proposal for Harvard to do that with what we call a Harvard Data Commons to pilot something like that. Exactly. I agree. I just meant, and I'm sorry, Ara, I jumped there, but I think it is also important based on the, to the extent that it's possible, the assessment of the sensitivity of the data, that there could be different grades of that. So in some cases that might be a better solution, but in other cases it might be okay to either have a differential private release or some other way of at least be able to register or provide an approval to download the data because the risk is more manageable. So I just think that it's not a all or nothing. It could be a few levels, grades of sharing.
Can I add something as well? So I appreciate the thought that we could make all data accessible by having it somewhere in the cloud, and you upload the analysis file. If we had infinite resources in the world, that would be a great solution. I think what strikes me is that when we look at our data versus downloads, a lot of them come from countries outside the US. A lot of them come from, I'm hoping, a lot of them come from researchers who actually live in the countries that are surveyed, where the surveys happen. I think these are populations who should have access to this data and often have already very little access. In addition to that, we have a lot of students, grad students, undergrads, who just kind of dig through the data, try out analysis. They cannot probably afford the types of access mechanisms where I've tried to access the census files. It's quite a process.
So the census files are particularly difficult to work with. But in terms of cost for students and so forth, the pricing is actually the reverse. It is much cheaper to do an analysis in the cloud than to download a copy of a data set. It is pennies if the systems are properly set up. And in terms of researchers in other countries, the educational issue is, learning how to work with that methodology. But for somebody who's working, in a country with poor internet access, it's going to be much easier for them to do an analysis in a cloud environment for pennies, even if they have to pay for it, than to download the data and try to run it locally, and ignoring the data security issues.
This is really fascinating discussion. I just wanted to sort of see if there's anybody from the audience who want to participate in the discussion. Anybody has any questions? Otherwise...
Yeah, I had one actually, because this is something that we've been working on with data here at Dime for the last couple of years. There is obviously something that we've encountered is the difference between kind of institutional, large-scale, and governmental data collection versus the kind of primary data that Anya's been talking about. We would love, I think, to have a lot of it permanently living in a cloud where you could do that kind of analysis. But with our data collection project model, basically after 2 years, after the data is collected, the funding stops. So we don't have anywhere to put it. We don't have any lawyers left we don't have any funding to even pay a lawyer to look at that data and say this is clear or not clear. So there's, a temptation to say, yeah, it's totally unreleasable, it's super private, like forget about it, lock it on my hard drive, throw it in the drawer. And we would love to have a resource, particularly one that, was funded kind of separately, where we could say, okay, realistically, how safe is this stuff? Realistically, can we clean it? Realistically, who owns it? And realistically, how can we make it available? Particularly, as you said, to people, the people who it's supposed to be surveying. So for us, it's a lot of times a resource constraint. I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, no, I just want to send a message in a bottle to the data group, since you guys are here, that we'd really appreciate some help in making that happen for development, econ data, that I think there's a lot of appetite. I was recently in a country that I will not name, working with an administration that I will not name, who has been sharing data a lot with an academic think tank that I will not name. And all of this, what happened with this is that then people from that, academic think tank, it's not in the room, kind of started to share these, administrative data sets with other researchers. And, it may be just people didn't think so hard about the NDAs they had signed. They didn't think about the fact that passing this data on incriminated somebody in that administration that could go to jail for basically, sharing this data. For the person, it's a country where, it's pre-authoritarian. So it wouldn't be really liked, I guess, in this administration. This person could just lose their job permanently. And I think as World Bank, we do have a responsibility to kind of bridge that gap. And so if the AEA is going to make, researchers open their data, which is awesome, how can we help that for development economics data? We are, it's easy for us to walk into a country, get an NDA signed, get the data, make people trust that we'll do the right thing with the data somehow. It's really hard for individual researchers to do that. And when they do it, oftentimes it's just not malicious, but it's just things go wrong. Like in this case, things went clearly very wrong. And that hurts everybody else because then nobody wants to share the data anymore, and it's a bad precedent. But even with primary collected data, like the example we were giving this morning about spatially identified things, I mean, these are things that researchers should be able to access to run certain types of regressions. I don't think we should delete these identifiers and never use them. I think we should be using them, but within the safety of a server that we own and curate. And so can we do that? Like, is that something we can do?
I'm just amazed that it took us a DIME event panel discussion to connect on this. So we are actually working on a lot of those efforts to create an institutional environment, especially if it is related to sensitive data, like I said, because that's become a big sort of focus for the bank, and also in our engagement with countries, because we're also want to support our countries in the way they have to disclose data and how they're protecting data. So I think because of the interest of time, I won't talk too much to that. But great to connect, and we'll talk offline on that. All great points. I wanted to go back to your question, and I wanted to take one more question before the panel comes back and addresses that.
I think someone else had something to say. This is a quick two-finger sort of on that. I really appreciated your characterization of one kind of threat. But I think that we need to be sober into the increasing number of authoritarian countries. Unfortunately, we live in a time of backsliding, and especially coming from where I come from, where I did a lot of sort of political science research, we have to be super careful not to allow the data sets to fall into the hands of certain governments. So I don't have a solution. Our solution was just to aggregate up and to sort of an absurd level of geographic obscurity where then it can't really be used except in a cold space environment. But just for us all to be aware of that.
Absolutely agree with you. Even we have countries changing laws recently, which basically really goes against a lot of the work that we do in this space. You said there's one more, maybe one.
So for Simpson, who mentioned the sort of the cloud or secure enclave computing, I'm curious how that interacts with my sort of overly stylized view of research, like the research that I've done, is to say, I was the first person to think to combine these two data sets that no one had ever linked before. And so how would that, in an ideal world, in the system that doesn't exist yet, how do you, if you believe that a lot of research is, new combination of linked data, how does that work in these secure enclaves?
These systems do exist, right? Because you can create an Amazon account, get $100 for free, and they have hundreds of terabytes of publicly available data that can be freely accessed from the Amazon Web Servers, the Amazon Web Services infrastructure. How did you combine them, and then you have to write your paper and get it published? That's the hard part.
So you would be able to still upload or
so just because
if one secure data set is in the census secure enclave and the other data set is in the somebody else's secure enclave.
Right, so federating secure enclaves is previously a research challenge, but no longer. We have good technology for doing that, and that's an administrative challenge now. It's not a research challenge. But even then, if you had approval of the data owners using existing technology and you did that federated join and got your p-value, you'd still have to get it published, right? But it's not about the data owners, and it's not like because you did the research in the cloud that somebody else is watching you, because there's privacy in the cloud. There's better privacy and security controls in cloud computing than there is in computing in your organizations, unless you've completely migrated to a good environment in the cloud. There's much better controls. There's much better auditing.
I had a question, maybe I ask. So just to your point, all your points about there's the risk of trying to release the data set, but then if you don't release it, there's this perceived lack of transparency, or there is a lack of transparency. My question being that, should we just sort of come to a conclusion there's no solution to like really anonymizing a data set? I mean, is there really a defense against anybody trying to de-identify? Like, you had some great points about you releasing a data set, but some new data sets could come and you don't know what happens to it. But at the same time, you do want to be able to share these data sets. Anya, do you think that, there is a legitimate community of users who would be kind of excluded if there was a screening process that we followed to provide access to these private data sets? I'm just curious. I mean, it's great that I had another question which you actually already had an answer to, which is the data audit, because I was going to ask, is there really any legitimate sort of issues that have come up, in people releasing anonymized data sets? But it seems like, based on your study, not really. But I'm curious about what your take is on if we were to like have a appropriate, all your take, but maybe I'll start with Anya.
So actually, first, in terms of the data audit, or I think this came up with several people here mentioned this also, that they were looking at data sets that were published and they found actual personally identifiable info, so actual direct identifiers in it. So I think it is an issue, and that is not even where you've kind of misassessed the risk. It's literally you made a mistake and released it. I do think that when you I'm an economist. I believe in incentives and I believe in barriers to access, in the sense that I don't think it would be impossible for many populations to access data if it's behind a wall in some way, but I think fewer people will do it. And I think that would be to the detriment of research, but also maybe even more so, possibly to the detriment of populations that are not even yet researchers. They might become researchers at some point, or they might become interested in this kind of work, but they are not currently there. And I think it will definitely increase the inequities, because the places that do have access, that will buy access to a database or will institute these types of mechanisms, will be the top research universities in the US on balance, but probably not a research university or any university in Africa, say. So I think there's going to be differences in access, and it will be increased by this. There is already huge differences in access, it's fair to say. I mean, even just internet access and so on. Having said that, I actually wanted to bring up two things. So first of all, I think there is this linking data sets question, I think, is an interesting one. I think another purpose that is much harder to do when you don't have direct access to the data and direct vision, like a look at the data, is actually learning about data. So I'm thinking again about our RAs, our junior research staff, or also about undergrads or grad students. The way I learned about data, the way I learned about understanding weird patterns and missing data, or data cleaning and so on, it was all from actually looking at data. And I think it would be extremely difficult to learn how to be good with data quality and collecting good data as well, without having direct access and a direct view of the data set and the individual data points. And I think it's something I encourage all my students. When I was at Brown, I would encourage all my students to do, to actually open up the data set, look through this, do all this tab and histograms and so on. Try to look at where's the censoring happening, what weird data outliers do you have, and so on. So that's one thing. The other thing I wanted to say, and that's on the positive side, there is the Data for Development initiative at Stanford. I think Pascaline Dupas is significantly involved in this. And they are collecting, curating a database of data sets, which is protected, access protected. So you have to apply for access in some form. I'm not entirely sure about all the procedures. But what they do have is also a visual interface that uses actually, you don't need to access the data. You don't need to apply for access, but instead you can look at what's in the data sets, and you can even look at what data is mergeable. Now, this is collected and curated at immense human just time input. So I think there's been a huge number of people involved in just cleaning this data, making it, harmonizing it, and bringing it together. But this does exist, and I think it's an amazing effort. I haven't looked at it recently. They keep adding data sets and so on, but it's a very impressive effort. But I should also say it's accessible for researchers in the US, or researchers at research universities. I don't know exactly how they would make it, for instance, accessible to like, I don't know, a student from Abujan or something, you know.
Yeah.
We have 5 minutes. So.
Okay, just quickly to give you some time to Simpson. When we're talking about releasing data, I just want to point out that even though we've had a huge push on releasing open data, and that was a necessary push, right, for transparency. And so recognizing there is a lot of data sensitive information, we should talk about it with a tiered access. So releasing data doesn't necessarily mean that you're releasing the entire data set, the raw data set. And I think if you start thinking about it this way, then you see the levels of what you can access. And at the very minimum, you should make a metadata, at least the citation metadata and descriptive metadata available so that it's findable, right? It's discoverable. If you make it discoverable in a global way, you're increasing the possibility for others to access it in other countries. But and some of the studies that looked at that, actually, it made more difference that the metadata had different languages than not the fact that the country, it was not so much economics of the country, but more of the language was there. So that it had translation, and so we should think about accessibility in a more broader way than just saying the entire data set is accessible and open, and you can have metadata that it's again accessible from a language point of view and searchable in many search engines, right? Then the other thing is that you can have descriptive statistics, you can have release of differential privacy. Not all the tools are there yet to do that, but we do have started to have the technologies to do that. And then the other layer is having this, being able to do the computation in the cloud and not downloading the data. And as part of this, one of the projects that we are integrating with is a project called TRSA, Trusted Remote Storage Agents, that allow you to have this remote storage, and every trusted, you have basically a trusted relationship with the different clouds that might contain the data, and you can do the analysis there.
Thank you so much. Please, go ahead. Yeah.
So I really want to dispel the idea that keeping data in the cloud in a trusted computing facility means you can't have browsing. If you want to let people browse the data, then it's a lot easier to browse it in the cloud. I'm very concerned about access to underserved communities, and the fact is most underserved communities, people don't have desktop computers and laptops, they have cell phones and tablets. And we can only support data access on those devices by using cloud-based resources. Nobody's going to be downloading 1 million records to their iPhone or to their $50 Android phone. But if we build systems that allow underserved communities to do data analyses that are relevant to them, the only way those resources are going to be accessed is with easy-to-use, multilingual user interfaces that are running on the devices that people have now. And so the very privileged idea of academics downloading data sets and doing analyses on their clusters or even on their MacBooks, or that's just not, that's a fantasy. It's going to be stuff in web browsers. It's not even going to be custom apps because nobody's going to have the time to write the apps. So.
Thank you. That was a really, very interesting debate. And I think we should sort of continue the discussion. And one proposal I would like to put on the table is that it would be great if all the agencies at least try and coordinate or keep each other informed about the different tasks that you're working on, so that there's more common understanding, or at least a sense of like common good practice in terms of how we should approach this problem as we go forward. Thank you all again for being here.
Okay, thank you very much.